We have an infrastructure problem in Brooklyn Heights. The triple cantilevered section of the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway that also supports the Brooklyn Heights Promenade was built 70 years ago and then neglected. The cost of that neglect is very high. The structure is now in such poor condition that it will soon be unsafe to drive over it. New York State had been planning to rehabilitate the triple cantilevers 20 years ago, then abandoned the project to the city in 2012 for budgetary reasons. Then in 2016, New York City DOT estimated $1.7 billion for its repair, and that estimate has now risen to $3.6 to $4 billion. At a town hall meeting in September 2018, New York City DOT presented two reconstruction plans, a lane-by-lane reconstruction and a 6-lane highway on top of the promenade while it repairs the underlying highway. The neighborhood was positively aghast at the Promenade Highway proposal, but it was also energized to find new solutions, and a very creative proposal emerged of placing the highway at grade level, capping it, and repurposing the triple cantilevers as parkland or retail space.
The Honorable Robert Moses, Construction Coordinator of the City of New York. Mr. Moses.
Mr. Hayes, Borough President Cashmore, ladies and gentlemen, this is an historic occasion, as Mr. Hayes has said, and it's a unique improvement. Now, this wasn't an easy thing to do. To begin with, I don't know whether most of you know the conditions under which work of this kind is undertaken. Naturally, the first inspiration was to go right through the heights, plow our way through and take whatever there was. John Cashmore and his associates knew this town pretty well, and they knew how difficult that would be. What an immense amount of destruction would be wrought by that process. And I think that it was quite possible that it couldn't have been done at all, that the opposition would have been so great and so justified that we couldn't have done it. So the alternative was to go along Furman Street, build up 2 levels above the ground, tear out these old structures and the gardens on top of them. And then we had the idea, all of us, that the thing to do was to put an esplanade on the top so that people who are not driving in cars and who are not in a hurry and who wanted to get this magnificent view of the harbor could get it on foot, could sit there and get the sun. And of course, to that idea was added the notion of having some playgrounds as large as we could afford, as large as we could get for mothers and children, and they were added. And I guess most of you have seen this construction underway. The work that Andrews and Clark did on a consulting basis, assisting John Cashmore and Bill Farley, is a first-rate job. I don't know anything quite like this in any other city in the world, and I'm sure Brooklyn appreciates it.
There used to be an active shipping business on the piers below the triple cantilevers until manufacturers moved out of New York City and large container ships moved to New Jersey's deeper harbors. The piers were quiet until 9 years ago when an incredible 85-acre park, Brooklyn Bridge Park, opened. Under a complicated deal, the park is now supported by fees from condominiums inside the park, not state nor city funds. In short, we got a fabulous park in exchange for allowing residential development inside. Unfortunately, when building this park, portions of its land were not reserved for repair work on the BQE.
We first moved to Brooklyn Heights and to Columbia Heights, right along the promenade, in 1968, just after I got out of law school. My predominant memory in those days was that the entire piers here were working piers. Ships used to come in from South America, and they would unload their cargo, and then I don't think they had so much cargo to load up, but they would unload their cargo, bananas and so forth, and then sail back. We used to see the tugboats getting the ships into their berths along the piers here. One day, long before I was a prosecutor, some official-looking fellows in their traditional little narrow ties and little hats knocked on the door, and they gave their identification. They said, "We're from the Bureau of Narcotics, now known as the DEA." But in those days, it was the Bureau of Narcotics. They said, "We would like to do some surveillance from your roof because we believe that a shipment of drugs is coming in, and we wanted to be up on your roof." So, and then, of course, the piers were unused for years, and they rotted, and that area was sort of a wasteland.
Deck parks above highways, an unusual solution to a real estate conflict when the Promenade was built in the late 1940s, are now increasingly being adopted in cities throughout the United States to provide open space and parkland, so vital to our well-being. Case in point, the Promenade. It's a place for families to gather and have fun. It's a place to share our sorrows. It's a place to discuss politics. It's a place to decompress. It's a place to watch the world evolve. It's a place to belong.
One of the great places to see people of all kinds is to come down to the Promenade, where people are walking their dog, taking the sun, and you can have conversations. They have time to do it. And I have a very good memory of coming down here and talking to people. And one of my campaign pictures was of me bending over and talking to a group of seniors sitting on the bench. I also remember the Promenade from, there's a federal judge by the name of Ed Corman. His father was an immigrant to the United States. He ironed shirts for 12 hours a day, and then after he retired and his son was a federal judge, he and a group of friends used to go down to the courthouse and observe all the trials, and they came back to the Promenade and they would talk about all the things that they thought about the trial that was going on, who was going to win, who was doing a great job. And so it's a great community gathering place.
A number of years ago, I worked at a very stressful job in Midtown Manhattan, and when I came home from work, I lived about a block away, I'd grab my daughter and drag her down here to watch the sunset. It's the most spectacular place to see a sunset in the city, and she hated it. She hated sunsets, she hated nature. Then, about a few months later, she came home from school with this painting of me and Mom watching the sunset.
I was originally on Montague Street in a cafe, having coffee with a friend after having dropped our kids at school. And we were vaguely aware that something had happened, that a plane, we pictured it was a small plane, had hit the World Trade Center. But then somebody ran into the cafe. She had come from the Brooklyn Bridge, and she said that both of the towers were burning, that the planes were large passenger planes that had actually gone into the middle of the towers. And we immediately, along with, I think, everyone in the restaurant, moved down to the Promenade. And we were standing here, for the most part, silent, trying to comprehend what had happened, what was behind this. And we're saying, I think people talked a little bit about whether or not there could be any chance of rescue. I think those obviously were just our imaginations trying to fill in. Eventually, I left, and then in the days and even the months that followed, people continued to come down to the Promenade. It became something like a spontaneous chapel, I think. Originally, there were a lot of notes where people were trying to find people, but then as there was the realization that people were not going to be found, Instead, it became a place of memorials.
The public dialogue began when DOT held a town hall meeting on September 27, 2018, to discuss the BQE reconstruction project, and it was packed. Here, Commissioner of Transportation Polly Trottenberg dropped the bomb. DOT was considering erecting a 6-lane highway on top of the promenade for 6 years while it fixed the underlying BQE.
So the Brooklyn Heights Association is the oldest continuously operating neighborhood association in New York City. We've been around since 1910, and the mission is to preserve and enhance the quality of life and the historic character of Brooklyn Heights. The Department of Transportation has proposed an alternative during the construction period for the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway rehabilitation, and the community was initially was right off the bat completely incensed about the proposal. One major pinch point, obviously, is on the south end, where the BQE rises up from the Atlantic Avenue exit and passes 360 Furman and goes up to Girolamo Street. It's not possible to build, because of the physical constraints of the building that's there, to build really wide parallel method.
My first connection with the BQE was that when I became Cobble Hill Association president, I met with our then Assemblywoman Eileen Dugan, which was at that point a state project, and which continued to be a state project for many years until the state dumped it. So she was very concerned about people dragging their heels and not addressing this issue. And as we were doing the first park plan, we assumed that this rehab was going to be done before the first spade was ever put in the ground for the park. But in the meantime, the park actually miraculously moved along faster than we had thought it might, and at the same time, the state decided to dump the project on the city, and the rehab of the BQE slowed down. So the sequencing that we had assumed was going to happen did not happen, and here we are, still dealing with the same knotty problem that Eileen Dugan identified to me 20-some years ago.
Yeah, I think we initially came together outraged over the idea that the promenade would become a 6-lane highway. And within really a week or a few days, we realized that this issue was so much bigger than the promenade. And it was really about much bigger issues. It was about communities over cars. It's about environmental impact of driving. It's about transportation solutions, about thinking really about the corridor, not in this short little span of the promenade, but really of the entire corridor that the BQE runs.
How do you reach people in power who are making decisions?
That's such a great question. I think there are lots of ways to do it, and over the course of the last year, we have tried many, but I think the thing that has really worked is people coming together and showing up and raising their voices and saying that this mattered to them. And I think the politicians and the people in power are taking note of that energy and taking note of our collective organization, and that's one way to reach them.
It's likely to go through a ULERT process, and that is a process where it goes to the community board, the borough president, the city planning commission, and ultimately the city council. The city planning commission and the city council have an up or down vote on it and disapprove a project proposal. The project will likely also require the alienation of parkland in some fashion, whether it's Brooklyn Bridge Park, whether it's Chapin Playground.
I think the critical thing is that we make sure that we are relying principally on mass transit rather than individual cars for people to get around. We took a very big step forward this year by passing this congestion pricing bill that will charge a substantial fee for people who want to drive into the central business district. That will generate a very large amount of money to upgrade the mass transit system and hopefully make it less necessary for people to drive. We do also need to be creative and be aware of our choices. We increasingly live in a world where people want to go online and buy something and have it delivered individually in a package to them, within a day or so. That is causing a great deal of our local truck traffic. And so, I think we need to think about different ways of delivering goods. That might involve finding greater ways to use rail and using, water transit. There are some efforts underway to reduce truck traffic within the city by barge transportation. But the biggest thing I think is to get people an option that works for them.
The Brooklyn Heights Association and A Better Way, which is focused solely on the BQE project, organized another town hall meeting, also packed, on April 3rd, 2019, to present alternate engineering proposals to those suggested by DOT. The audience was nearly drooling at one of the proposals put forth by a Danish architecture firm, BIG, which combined the promenade and Brooklyn Bridge Park and placed the BQE inside a tunnel. Many of our elected officials stood up and spoke in support of our neighborhood. New York City Comptroller Scott Stringer, New York City Council Speaker Corey Johnson, New York City Councilman Stephen Levin, New York State Senator Brian Kavanaugh, New York State Assembly Member Joanne Simon, and Borough President Eric Adams. A few hours before this town hall meeting, to calm the irate crowd, Mayor De Blasio announced the formation of a 16-person panel chaired by Carlos Sassour, President and CEO of the New York Building Congress, to evaluate the project. A few short weeks after this town hall meeting, on May 16, 2019, Mayor De Blasio announced that he was running for President of the United States, from where else but the Brooklyn Heights Promenade.
This is one of the most complicated highways in America. So if you think about it, on one side, you have the Hudson River and Brooklyn Bridge Park. On the other side, you have Brooklyn Heights and the Promenade. Underneath it, you have sewer lines, water mains. You then have MTA, fan stations, substations, and tunnels bringing trains from Manhattan to Brooklyn. So you can imagine that in all of this, there is a highway. And every little inch of space has to be carefully looked at before anything can happen. You also have residential buildings in Brooklyn Bridge Park, residential buildings and homes on the other side, a landmark district, a landmark promenade. I mean, you can imagine it's a case study for anybody in engineering school, I think. Design build works for a lot of projects. It's not a win for every project, but there are certain things where it works. And, design build is an interesting mechanism where everybody sits together from day one and works on the project together. It speeds up, it keeps things under budget, and it allows, I think, for a comprehensive role for everybody.
Some really incredible things emerged over the past 8 months. One is New York City approved congestion pricing. And congestion pricing is where people are charged a fee to go over the bridges into the lower parts of Manhattan.
The difference between an infrastructure and a living person is that you have a certain amount of time to live. An infrastructure can be forever. And you look back at the Roman aqueducts are still around. You look at the pyramids, are still around. So infrastructure, if it's maintained, that will continue to service.
Some exciting tunnel solutions, which would reroute truck and express traffic below the East River or below downtown Brooklyn, leaving the triple cantilevers or Furman Street for local traffic, were discussed in a report by New York City DOT in 2016. The costs were estimated at $7.5 to $8.6 billion, a high expense for the city to undertake alone.
One of the proposals, and I will tell you because I was part of it in 2015, is to actually build a tunnel that starts, when BQE turns into the, next to the iguanas and tries to go to the tunnel. It's from about that area, you start digging a tunnel that ends up at Tillery. Mm-hmm. So you bypass all of this thing. Tunnels are tunnels, you can go deep down. That's not going to be an issue. Trust me, there are very few things there when you go down. Is it cheap? Nothing is cheap.
Okay.
But it's not that expensive that you cannot do it. Now, if you do that, the best way of doing it is by utilizing P3, a public-private partnership, in which you go to, because you can now charge tolls. Mm-hmm. Tolls is not something that people want to hear, but it is done. And if you generate revenue, now you can interest another party that they have money and they want to park it somewhere to bring them revenue. So they're willing to take the risk to build it, and they will collect tolls for a certain number of years. Could be 20, could be 50, could be 100, whatever that is. Government will have a role in actually controlling the amount of money that one can charge, and the concessionaire will actually have the obligation not only to build it, but to maintain it. So at the end of, let's say, 50 years, they will say, here is your facility back in good working order, everything is good. So you now can do it again or can operate it yourself, whatever you want to do.
We now know induced demand means that people will ride on those free bridges and will always fill them up above capacity. So actually using pricing to manage the demand of the system is a more effective public policy than just trying to build your way out of the problem. You can't look at the BQE in isolation. From an engineering perspective, yes, you know, consider the specific situation. But from a transportation point of view, it's part of a network. The big change here is going to be congestion pricing. Right now, something like a quarter of the people who are driving on the BQE in the morning are coming from South Brooklyn and they're going to Manhattan, and there's a more direct route for them to take that doesn't include the BQE, and it's called the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel. So we're essentially paying them to wait in traffic on the BQE. About 15% of the vehicles, I think it was, on the BQE on a daily basis are goods movement. About half of them have local origins or destination. And if you force them off the BQE, they'll just have to go on local roads. But half of the goods movement is not locally based. The reason they're on the BQE is because we have crazy tolling on the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, where it's free in one direction.
Government says, I'm going to give you a contract, you bear all the risks. Well, if you are putting all the risks on you and you're not sharing any of the risks, guess what? I'm going to price that accordingly. So you're telling me to take the risk? Good. And when I give you back my price, I will include the risk that you're asking me to assume. So that will be more expensive. If the risk materializes, I was covered. If the risk doesn't materialize, I'm making more money. So the point I'm trying to make here is that you need to make a change in order to arrive at a balance between the risk. You have to share in the risk. Now, so the idea of actually doing a rebuilding of the BQE and putting traffic for 2 years on the promenade up there is, the only way I would refer to it, insane. Now, what do you do with the local traffic? By this architectural firm, and it's a pretty good solution. Yes, this solution will require one to actually, during construction, to take the park, to destroy part of the park that is basically on the western edge. And that will have to be rebuilt, and by lowering the way that is being proposed, they will be able to utilize the cantilever area for something else. And would not even require, if you don't want to do a reconstruction, a total reconstruction. You can fix it, because it's not going to carry anything massive.
We've seen an important artery in the regional transportation network deteriorate due to decades of neglect and a lack of coordination between the city, state, and its agencies. We've seen it become increasingly expensive to fix. We've seen real estate and park development allowed to proceed without planning for adjacent highway repairs. We've seen the importance of the promenade to the social fabric of Brooklyn Heights, why its view is landmarked, and why tourists from around the world flock here. Now that we're in a state of crisis and public outcry has been acknowledged, experts from various fields are meeting to find solutions. They are tackling the issues of a growing population, emerging technologies, and increased congestion from Uber and Lyft, e-commerce, and bike lanes. They're beginning to institute measures to shift traffic through tolling, congestion pricing, tax incentives, induced demand, HOV lanes, off-hours delivery rules, and investments in mass transit. Among the solutions for the triple cantilevers, a tunnel bypassing it would be ideal, a new capped highway and repurposing of the triple cantilevers would be excellent, rebuilding the same highway would be short-sighted, and building a promenade highway would be preposterous. The million-dollar question is, which plan DOT will adopt to rehabilitate the triple cantilevers and the 20 other bridges along the corridor between Atlantic and Sand Street?
Ways of the city and the boroughs are underneath this promenade, and while we promenade above all this traffic with this magnificent panorama of New York Harbor, will none of us be aware that thousands and thousands of automobiles are rushing in both directions along these shelves of Brooklyn Heights, along historic Furman Street, and one of the business. There goes the ribbon, and it's just been cut by the mayor of the city of New York, the Honorable Vincent Impellitteri, Borough President Cashmore, and Commissioner Moses.
That was my 15th one. Oh, yay! That was my 17th.
All right. There wasn't enough noise pollution on the beach.
Yeah.